Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 305, The Second War of Religion. In the summer of 1566, the Dutch revolt broke out in the Netherlands. This led to an immediate heightening of tensions between Huguenots and Catholics in France. Not only was the revolt right on the kingdom's border, but the Spanish were also deeply unpopular in France at the time. Catherine, at the time, though, couldn't resist a dig at the failure of Philip's rigorous and uncompromising policies in the Low Countries. She wrote as follows to him: "Take us as an example, for we have sufficiently shown, at our own cost, how others should govern themselves." But if Catherine believed Philip was about to take a page from her toleration playbook, she was sadly mistaken, as we know his response was anything but tolerant. In France, Catherine continued her policy of peace first, everything else second. Her only goal was to ensure that either side not antagonize the other. That being said, by the summer of 1566, the Guise faction had yet again quit court, as Coligny and their Protestant faction appeared to have the king's ear, at least for the moment. The Huguenots naturally took full advantage of their moment of seeming royal favor, and began to press the cause of their co-religionists in the Netherlands, whose calls for aid grew ever more urgent. Coligny, offering Huguenot military assistance, argued forcefully that French interests would be served if they helped eject Spain from the neighboring Low Countries, even suggesting that Charles might like to add these territories to France. Catherine promptly put a stop to this discussion. The very last thing she wanted was to inflame Philip. Besides, she needed help from him with yet another of her marriage projects. In this case, she wished to marry the king to one of the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian's daughters. Now, she mistakenly imagined that Philip would feel grateful for her stand against Coligny's plans, and in return, underwrite this project. He wouldn't. However, a further bond between the two dynasties formed, when word arrived that Elizabeth, after suffering several miscarriages, had, on the 12th of August 1567, successfully given birth in Spain to a daughter, the Infanta, the former queen. Charles ultimately turned down Coligny's request for France to intervene in the Netherlands. As a result, in part of French neutrality, Philip prepared to send his massive army to suppress the rebellion. But his proposed route infuriated Catherine. Philip wanted his army to disembark at Fus in southern France and then march overland through French territory to the Netherlands. Catherine gave a quick and blunt answer to this request: no way. Peace in her kingdom was precarious at best, and the notion of 20,000 Spanish troops marauding their way through the French countryside was not something that Catherine was about to even consider. Nor would she consider Philip's request that France should join his quote-unquote righteous crusade. In the end, Philip found a different route, though it wasn't honestly much better, given that it essentially led the Spanish army through Savoy and Lorraine, around the Rhine River and up towards the Netherlands. The Spanish army marched toward Flanders, though Philip had decided not to lead his troops himself, but put the Duke of Alba at their head, and then simultaneously he had decided to replace Margaret as regent of the Netherlands, both facts we already know. The Duke had orders to repress and, if need be, exterminate the rebels without mercy, a job he was good at. Such a large Spanish force on her northern border posed a critical danger to France. So amid a lot of anxiety on the Royal Council, Catherine and Charles set out immediately to inspect their northern defenses. As an additional precaution, Charles hired 6,000 Swiss mercenaries, as well as reinforcing garrisons at Piedmont, Champagne, and what are called, in the historical records, the three bishoprics. These are the cities of Toul, Metz, and Verdun. Philip found these security measures outrageously insulting for some reason. And the Spanish ambassador protested to the Queen Mother, quote, "The king has no need of such an army." The king she's talking about there is Charles. Catherine, knowing well the reputation for ferocity of the Spanish soldiers, felt equally incensed that she had not been kept fully informed of Philip's plans. She commanded the French ambassador in Madrid to explain her situation, rhetorically asking, "Is it reasonable that among all the violent turbulence which is everywhere, we should be at the mercy of anyone who wishes to do us harm?" Typically, at the same time, to keep Philip assured of her overall goodwill and good intentions, she sent his army supplies of grain. This was also strategically a good idea. Catherine had good reason to feel the predations of foreign powers. Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, was enjoying a brief respite in his war against the Turks, and he might also find this a good moment to attack an enfeebled France. Meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth I of England had just sent Thomas Norris as a special envoy to the French court to demand the return of Calais. Catherine wrote a rather uncompromising reply that Charles signed his name to. Quote, "Since the Queen, Elizabeth I, had broken the peace herself by taking Le Havre, she should renounce Calais and be content to keep the natural boundaries of her kingdom." End quote. By the summer 1567, Dutch Protestants had become convinced that the 6,000-strong French army, those were those aforementioned Swiss mercenaries, on their border was about to be used against them. There were two reasons for this. First, King Charles kept the army in place even after the Duke had moved the Spanish army deep into the Netherlands, and therefore the danger had ostensibly passed. Second, rumors abounded with tales of Catholic atrocities against Huguenots throughout the French countryside. There had been atrocities, but interestingly, they had gone the other way. Catherine quickly made it clear she wouldn't tolerate such lawlessness, and the Protestants within the French court quickly found themselves on the outside looking in. That was how quickly royal favor might change in the late 16th century. Moreover, the executions, as we know, of several leading nobles back in the Netherlands made Condé, Coligny, and the other Huguenot nobles more than a little nervous, though Catherine assured them that she intended to scrupulously follow the Edict of Amboise. But the late 16th century was a tough time for trust. There were so many rumors and counter-rumors that everyone was so much on edge. So it was that when Charles refused to dismiss his Swiss mercenaries, everybody assumed the worst. Huguenots quickly began to plan for conflict, concocting an elaborate plot to capture the royal family and then take several large towns that could stand as Huguenot bastions in the event of an all-out civil war. On September the 18th, word finally reached Catherine detailing the Protestant preparations. She brushed them off. Montmorency, still in charge of protecting the royal family, did so as well. But he was sadly mistaken. His spy network wasn't what it had been years before, and the Huguenots had gotten a lot better at screening their movements. So it was that while the Spanish continued to warn Catherine of an impending attack, she kept enjoying an Indian summer and her hunt. But by September 26, 1567, even Catherine could no longer ignore the reality. There had been far too many reports of Huguenot troops taking up positions in and around where the court was situated. So, Catherine recalled the Swiss Guard, which wasn't far off, but far enough away that it needed to be recalled, and then she moved the court to the nearby fortified town of Meaux. At 3 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of September, the Swiss troops arrived, and taking the advice of the Guises against that of the Constable, Catherine decided to make a dash for Paris, preferring to risk flight rather than be besieged at Meaux. At the center of a square troop of formation, surrounded by a, quote, forest of Swiss pikes, end quote, the Queen Mother and the King, their family, and most senior nobles set out for the capital. Terrified, the rest of the court joined the exodus as best they could. Rebel cavalrymen harried and attacked the party several times at the start of a hazardous journey, but the Swiss were able to successfully repulse each assault. Finally, it was decided that Catherine, the King, and her children should dash ahead in light carriages with a small guard to Paris, where they arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning, eventually followed by the rest of the party. The courtier's appearance made a rather uninspiring spectacle as they entered the city, disheveled, terrified, and exhausted, many of them having made the entire journey on foot. Throughout the sprint to Paris, Catherine had watched Charles weep with rage and promised from that day onward, quote, he would never allow anyone to frighten him again, and swore to pursue the culprits into their houses and beds. He intended henceforth to lay down the law to everyone, great and small. End quote. The Huguenots, frustrated at missing their opportunity to capture the royal family, decided to make camp at Saint-Denis, then outside Paris, now within Paris, and if you're listening to this, really basically the site of the 2024 Olympics. From there, they would blockade the Seine and prepare to besiege the city of Paris itself. Catherine sent for Condé to see what terms might bring an end to all of this. He responded that the royal Catholic faction needed to disarm entirely, that the Edict of Amboise had to be fully and faithfully reinstated, and that, as an aside, taxes needed to be lowered. To that end, he demanded that the Estates General be recalled into session. He told the king's messengers that the French people were suffering under the onerous debts caused by foreigners, and especially the Italians, a direct attack on Catherine and the Italian moneylenders who propped up her regime. Exasperated, Catherine determined that she could no longer play the role of peacemaker. Here's where things really start to change in our French story. Charles was now left with no choice but to fight the rebels head on. Civil war was inevitable. The king quickly raised an army, while Catherine reached out to Philip of Spain as well as the Pope for assistance. On October the 7th, as tradition demanded, a herald of the king approached Condé and the other rebel leaders and demanded that they disband their army. Condé replied that he was not a rebel. He merely wanted to save France from its present troubles. But the time for talk was over. On November the 10th, the constable rode out of Paris at the head of the king's 16,000-man strong army. Charles had made an impetuous attempt to lead the army himself, but Montmorency had wisely held the reins of the king's horse because he need not risk himself fighting these rebels, the 74-year-old constable of France told the king. A sweeping and courageous cavalry charge by Condé nearly won the battle, but was repulsed by the royal troops, and by nightfall the Huguenot army quit the field. During the battle, the constable received a mortal wound. Having endured several blows to the face and head, an arquebus shot in the back left him dying in agony. Carried back to the city, and after much suffering, the old man died on the 12th of November. Catherine and the king ordered a funeral with such honors that it could almost have been mistaken for a royal interment. Montmorency was finally laid to rest at Saint-Denis, near the tomb of Henry II, the king that he had loved and served so faithfully. Having lost the constable, Catherine now made a grievous error. She appointed her 16-year-old son, Henri of Anjou, lieutenant general of the army. Not only did he have no military experience at all, but she surrounded the teenager with a motley crew of petty lords who were much more interested in fighting amongst themselves than advancing on Condé. Meanwhile, Condé had withdrawn towards the east and eventually joined his forces with those of a large contingent of German reiters, hired troops from Protestant princes, who had come to his aid. Just before Christmas 1567, Catherine summoned the Spanish ambassador and asked him to join her for a walk in the gardens of the Tuileries, where building had started on a new palace. Catherine excused her son, Henri of Anjou, military's incompetence by blaming his youth. But the ambassador responded rather uncompromising. "Why blame your son's youth?" he asked, when she, Catherine, had chosen idiots as his chief commanders. Those men, Cossé, was a nobody. Nemours was too love-struck to think of war, and Montpensier was an absolute fool. This man, whose name was Alva, strongly advocated that the Queen Mother appoint Tavannes, a great and loyal soldier who would not flinch from doing his duty. And so, in January 1568, Catherine set out for Anjou's headquarters at Charles-le-Mans. The disarray of the camp was obvious. Had it not been for the arguments between two senior officers, who preferred to arrange a private quarrel between themselves before taking up arms, the German riders might have been prevented from uniting with the rest of the enemy army. Furthermore, with the army chiefs unable to agree on a course of action, the Queen found her son and his commanders in a state of hopeless chaos. She therefore followed the Spanish ambassador's advice and placed Tavannes at the head of a vanguard of an army and decided that they should proceed to Troyes to stop the Huguenots from capturing the heartlands of France. Now, it was around this time that Catherine also entered into secret talks with the rebels about a potential resolution to all of this. While these talks ultimately came to nothing, they still cost Catherine politically when rumors of them leaked out. The Parisians, who had suffered greatly under the blockade, were furious that the Queen Mother would accept anything but the complete obliteration of the Huguenot scourge. There were even a few riots that the Royal Guard had to quell as a result. Despite the bitterly cold winter of 1566-68, the Huguenots and the German riders made substantial advances, reaching Angers and then racing onwards to take Bieux. In the face of the Protestant progress, Anjou was forced to pull back his forces, and Paris once again lay open to the enemy. Charles, already angry at his brother's military command and incompetence, declared that he himself would lead the royal army to victory. But Catherine refused to allow the king to expose himself to such danger. Condé managed to reach Chartres in late February and laid siege to the city, but his campaign stopped there due to a lack of money and supplies. During the war, both sides had been pillaging the countryside, leaving the land ravaged and the peasants in a precarious state. Now there remained nothing to live off of. Condé sent out an urgent appeal to the king for talks, which he answered and resulted in the Peace of Longjumeau, signed on the 23rd of March, 1568. As usual, of course, everyone hated the deal, but it had the upshot of ending the war, and really that's the only conclusion that matters. Essentially, Charles paid the German mercenaries to get them off of French soil and reinstated the Peace of Amboise, and the Protestants, for their part, were supposed to hand back all the towns that they had taken during the very brief but very chaotic Second War of Religion. Unfortunately, implementing the peace proved much harder than negotiating it. Protestants refused to hand over some towns. There were wanton acts of barbarism on both sides, and frankly, to a large extent, the quote-unquote peace was worse than the war for many French citizens. As the violence escalated, it became clear that the Peace of Longjumeau could barely even be called a truce. One Protestant historian claimed that more Huguenots died during the period after the Second Civil War than during both the first two wars together. By late April 1568, when Catherine called the King's Council, she no longer knew what to do. On April 28th, she fell desperately ill with a high fever, suffering from agonizing headaches, vomiting, and pains to her right side. By May 10th, as Catherine started to bleed from her nose and mouth, the council began discussions about what they should do in the event of her death. During these urgent council meetings, Charles had been lost without his mother to guide him. True to form, the Bishop of Lorraine pressed for the most stringent measures of repression and punishment against the Huguenots. And Catherine's chief counselor, de L'Hôpital, equally true to his form, advised further conciliation. Just as all hope seemed lost, Catherine's fever started to reduce. Though the illness and sweating returned in the evening, her bedclothes had to be changed 4 or 5 times each night, she managed to do a little work during the day. By the 24th of May, she sat propped up in bed dictating letters and sent one to Coligny about the theft of money intended to pay for the departure of the German mercenaries. Charles's almost total paralysis without his mother beside him had been an alarming taste of what to expect if Catherine did, in fact, die. Of the rash political assassinations that followed the Treaty of Longjumeau, one commenter remarked, quote, "Since France has learned Italian fashion in murder, and the custom has grown of hiring assassins to cut throats as one might make a deal with a mason or a carpenter, it would be almost a novelty if several days were to pass without some crime of this sort. Whereas formerly a man might not hear of a murder more than 10 times in his lifetime. We know that it was the ancient custom of France, and more religiously observed than anywhere else, to attack an enemy openly, never taking him unarmed or otherwise at a disadvantage, but always warning him about giving him time to draw and considering it unfair to attack him 2-1. Of all this, I've heard the Italians make great sport," end quote. The blame for all this was often laid, unfairly, at the door of course, the Italian Queen Catherine and the Italian habits she had brought with her. There was a general sense that social order was disintegrating. What had begun as a religious struggle was turning into an anarchic, depraved free-for-all. Now all this was going on. The Dutch Republic and revolt continued to burn. A few weeks after the peace in France, a group of French Protestants moved to join their religious brethren in the Netherlands. Luckily, Catherine found out about it in time and had the force intercepted and turned around. Had the French army crossed the border, Philip would have been rightly incensed. Then, on the 29th of July, 1568, Catherine ordered Condé arrested. Clearly, throughout the course of the preceding year, her attitude toward the Huguenots had decisively changed. Condé, with such a massive retinue that the Protestants dubbed it a modern flight from Egypt of God's chosen people, fled to La Rochelle. Catherine's problem was that as the economic situation deteriorated and the civil wars grew in intensity and number, so grew the number of Huguenots. The people of France were proving themselves increasingly interested in John Calvin's message of reform and change. Calvin's doctrine seemed to effectively fit with calls for social and political reform to such an extent that it became difficult to determine whether people were actually converting out of religious conviction or for some other purpose, probably political. All of this only hardened Catherine's attitude. She now wrote openly of a desire to, quote, run them, the Huguenots, to earth, defeat them, and destroy them before they can do something worse, end quote. And it wasn't just the religious situation that was impacting her mood. Since August, Charles IX had been ill, and his condition seemed to worsen with every day. Catherine did not know it, but her son was suffering from the final stages of tuberculosis. While caring for Charles, Catherine received word that Pope Pius V had authorized a special levy on church property to pay for what seemed like an imminent third religious war. Catherine was inclined to do so, but her chancellor, l'Hôpital, objected, arguing this would only provoke the Huguenots further. This was the final break for l'Hôpital, who found himself so isolated due to this position that he was shortly thereafter forced to retire. His resignation was a signal. The time for conciliation was over. By mid-August, the king had recovered enough to attend council sessions once more. The atmosphere, however, remained somber. War loomed, and everyone knew it. Henry of Anjou was positively giddy at the idea of leading an army to victory. Catherine prepared what was eventually to be called the Declaration of Saint-Maur, in which, in effect, she revoked the Edict of Amboise and declared Catholicism the only legal religion that could be practiced in France. But Catherine found her work on this interrupted again when Charles's condition suddenly worsened. Yet somehow, eventually, he recovered. But the news for Catherine's family wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. In Spain, on October the 3rd, Elizabeth died, having given birth to another child prematurely. Catherine was shocked at the news and upon hearing it withdrew from court without so much as a word. There was little time to grieve, however. War was upon France, although a harsh winter prevented any immediate military engagements. There was little talk now in the council about a potential compromise. Even that Catherine would not hear. She wanted a decisive victory this time. Interestingly, Catherine commented around this time that she envied Queen Elizabeth of England, whose subjects followed the religious policy to the T as set by the crown. Elizabeth would have been overjoyed by this statement had it been remotely accurate. On February the 22nd, Catherine visited the fortifications at Metz. It was a cold, wet day. Shortly thereafter, she fell ill with a fever and remained so, while Anjou fought his first major battle, the first of what is now, by the way, the Third War of Religion. The Battle of Jarnac, situated near Cognac, was notable, apart from being a royalist victory over the Huguenots, for the final death of the Huguenot leader, Louis de Condé. The royal army, though nominally led by Anjou, was de facto commanded by Catherine's trusty, now Marshal Tavannes. On March 13, 1569, after the royalist had finally succeeded in engaging Coligny and his men in battle, Condé, who had injured his leg the night before, received an urgent summons to bring help to Coligny. According to the account of his death by the Huguenot soldier and scholar Agrippa de Albigny, Condé mounted his horse awkwardly and broke his injured leg so badly that the bone pierced the side of his boot. Despite this, he cried out, quote, "To face danger for Christ is a blessing. Brave and noble Frenchmen, this is the moment we have waited for," end quote. He then galloped off at the head of a splendid, though hopeless, cavalry charge. Coligny, interestingly enough, had already countermanded his request for help, but the news did not reach Condé in time. When his horse was killed from under him, he couldn't get to his feet properly, weighed down by his armor and the pain of his broken leg. He surrendered and lifted his visor. The two soldiers to whom he gave himself up, who were interestingly named de Argens and Monsieur de Saint-Jean, recognized him immediately. De Argens had fought at Angoulême with Condé, where the prince had, interestingly enough, saved his life. Saint-Jean also knew him by sight. They advised him to keep his visor down if he valued his safety. The approaching guard of the Duke of Anjou spotted the prince and shouted, "Kill, kill." At this, Condé turned and said, "You cannot save me, de Argens." Anjou's guard then, rather unceremoniously, shot Condé in the back of the neck, the bullet exiting from his right eye. Anjou savored the death of his princely relative. His men tied Condé's body to a mule and paraded it around to shouts and jeers of the engaging little ditty, quote, "He who avoids the mass now is tied to an ass." It is catchy, I'll give it that. Such behavior was worlds away from the chivalric traditions that had been so highly valued by the previous generation. In a stark contrast, previously, when Francois, Duke of Guise, had taken Condé prisoner after the Battle of Dreux, he had invited him to stay with him, and they dined together. Now asked what to do with the crowd of captives nearby, Anjou is alleged to have ordered, quote, "Slay them all," end quote. He left this task to the Swiss mercenaries. This conduct on the field of battle demonstrates clearly how the usual courtesies and traditions of knightly conduct had been entirely replaced in these French wars of religion by the passion for vengeance as a result of the appalling acts each side had now committed against each other since the first religious civil war. I suppose it's a truism that civil wars and wars of religion tend to produce the worst atrocities. Thus, we have a combination here, civil war and war of religion. So, should we be surprised just how ghastly these French wars were? Anjou proudly announced his victory to Charles, who was certainly jealous of his brother's accomplishment. Admiral de Coligny was now the sole leader and figurehead of the Huguenot cause. The Catholics knew he presented a formidable enemy. He inspired near veneration amongst his Huguenot followers. So it was that on April the 7th, 1569, the Spanish ambassador went to see Catherine about how they might deal with the Coligny situation. Together, they agreed it would be best for Coligny to, not be alive anymore. To that end, they placed massive bounties on the heads of all the remaining Huguenot leaders, Coligny included. So when many of these men fell desperately ill on and around May the 7th, 1569, everyone assumed Catherine had been behind it. And remember, everyone believes Italians all know how to poison people, so it wasn't much of a logical leap to look at the events and presume ill intentions. This might seem like simple expediency to us, but at the time it was a very dishonorable way to deal with your enemies. You had to meet them face to face and win, not poison their food and drink. Anjou and the War Council now desperately needed Catherine's presence. The Huguenots had the support of various German Protestant princes and their armies. The Duke of Bavaria, the Duke of Zweibrücken, and I'm doing my absolute best on that one, and the Flemish Prince Louis of Nassau were facing a royalist army of French Catholics, Swiss mercenaries, troops financed by Spain, Italians from Rome and Tuscany, and soldiers led by the Margrave of Baden and the Count Ernest de Mansfeld. The sides were numerically fairly evenly matched by the autumn of 1569, with the royalists holding a slight advantage. Despite this, the royalist troops felt that their victory at Jarnac had been wasted and were angry that the armies of the foreign Protestant princes had successfully joined the forces due to blunders by Charles' commanders. Luckily for Charles, one of the leading German leaders died after consuming, allegedly, poisoned wine. His forces failed to link up with the rest, weakening the Protestant position at a crucial moment. In July of 1569, Charles passed an edict confiscating all Huguenot property. Coligny was also declared a traitor and sentenced to death, a difficult sentence to carry out given that the Catholic faction, didn't have possession of him. On July the 14th, the Huguenots laid siege to Poitiers, but by the 5th of September, Anjou had managed to lift it. Already, he was beginning to prove himself an excellent student in the art of war. Then, on October the 3rd, 1569, Anjou engaged his enemy in battle near Montcouture. Despite a series of brave cavalry charges by Coligny, who was shot in the face at one point, the Catholics held the field at the day's end. That night, as many as 15,000 French Protestant soldiers were put to death. Coligny still had a substantial army, however. In fact, nearly all of his losses had been infantry, his cavalry totally intact. He withdrew to La Rochelle and fortified the approaches as best he could. Tavannes wanted to pursue Coligny immediately and put an end to the war. But when Charles arrived on the field, he wanted a chance to win some glory for himself. So instead, the army decided to spend the necessary time taking each stronghold approaching La Rochelle, rather than simply just setting off immediately to finish the job. After the battle, though, the Protestants remained confident, and so both sides decided that the time was right to open some sort of peace negotiations. The king seemed opposed to anything other than total capitulation, however. Peace talks now centered around a proposed marriage between Margot, Catherine's eldest remaining and single daughter, and Henry of Navarre. The idea was basically the same as the one that had ended the Wars of the Roses, when Elizabeth of York married Henry Tudor. At the same time, however, the Cardinal of Lorraine was trying to arrange a marriage between Margot and his nephew, Henry of Guise, for whom Margot seems to have held a genuine affection. Charles hated that idea and flew into a rage when he found out that the two were evidently already romantically involved. The Queen Mother summoned Margot before herself and the king, who beat Margot for her temerity. All this family drama then led to real consequences. The Cardinal of Lorraine wisely quit court when everyone found out he was behind this alleged marriage union. He was perhaps the most hawkish of any of the king's advisors, so his absence allowed peace talks to proceed in earnest by the end of July. Catherine worked tirelessly to find a solution acceptable to all. The result was the Treaty of Saint-Germain on August 8, 1570. Its main terms mirrored the Peace of Amboise, of 1563, it allowed the freedom of conscience and freedom of worship with restrictions as to location. La Rochelle, Cognac, Montauban, and La Charité were granted as places of worship where the Protestants were free. In addition, goods and properties seized during the Civil War were to be restored. There was to be no discrimination against Huguenots regarding universities, schools, or hospitals, to which they were to enjoy the same access as other citizens. Once again, both sides greeted this enlightened treaty with very little enthusiasm. The Catholics grumbled that they were giving away more than was needed, while the Protestants thought they weren't being given enough. Charles solemnly commanded his counselors to swear adherence to the treaty's terms, and Catherine later wrote, quote, "I am glad that my son is now old enough to see that he is better obeyed than in the past. I will help him with my counsels and with all my power, and will assist him in enforcing the terms which he has conceded, as I have always wanted to see this kingdom restored to the state it was under its royal predecessors." End quote. In the end, Catherine probably just saw the Treaty of Saint-Germain as a reprieve. She wanted time to consolidate power. The war had not ended because either side had won, but because both sides were exhausted. Catherine realized that two religions just didn't work in France, at least the France that was. And in many respects, it was a France that was quite medieval. But time was important. It was time for her to recover and consolidate power. She would need every second, as we will see next time.